welcome to the second episode ever of the Food History Happy Hour. I forgot to introduce myself last time, so I'm Sarah Wasberg-Johnson, also known as the Food Historian. Yay, hi Erin. Erin is watching. I actually have two people watching right now. I wonder if the other person's Carla. Anyway, sorry about the delay and the technical difficulties, but I'm really excited that you guys are here. And we're going to make another cocktail tonight, which should be super fun. Hi, Andy. All right, so I had a request last time, I think it was by Erin, to see Sweetie Pie, who is my Shetland sheepdog. I'm also going to shut this blind behind me. It's very distracting with the cars going by. So I'm going to shut the blinds. Hi, Glenn and Carla. And go get Sweetie Pie so you guys can all meet her. So BRB. You want to come behind me, Sweetie Pie? You want to come behind me? Come here. Okay. So this is Sweetie Pie, my little Shetland sheepdog. She's sniffing everything. She's the bestest dog ever. And she's pretty cute too. She's a little sleepy right now. She's just taking a nap. Don't worry, I didn't wake her up. She's been napping all day. So yeah, here she is. Look at how cute that face is. The cutest face ever. Oh, she loves the chin scritches. Does anybody else have their pets joining them for happy hour this evening? Last time I had some problems, I noticed after the fact that you guys were commenting and I was not seeing your comments until significantly after you commented. So if there's any kind of delay in my response, I apologize for that. But anyway, I think we're going to get started. What do you think, Sweetie Pie? You want to hang out on the couch while I do this? I think so. There's a convenient couch right here. Alrighty. So, you guys had some really good questions last week, some of which I couldn't answer, some of which you sent me after the fact. And I promised that we would talk about cranberries. And I did say I was going to try and do a cranberry juice cocktail, but I'm not going to tonight for a variety of reasons. One of which is I forgot to get it at my one grocery run that I did this week. And I really didn't want to go back out just for cranberry juice. The other reason is that commercially produced cranberry juice was not in widespread use until the 1940s. And it was not used in cocktails until the 1950s-ish, late 40s, early 50s, so not until after World War II. So tonight, instead, I am going to make a 1940s cocktail. Let me remind myself of exactly the date here. This cocktail is from, I took notes, give me a second. Oh, it's not 1940s. It's from 1917. 1917, Recipes for Mixed Drinks is the name of the book. And I am, against Emily's suggestion, going to make the Florida special. Now, that might seem like a bad idea given everything that's going on in Florida right now. But to be perfectly honest, I have oranges that need to be used up. And it's kind of a cool cocktail. So it calls for a Collins glass and one cube of ice, just one. So we're going to start with that. Collins glass. I'm going to put in 2 cubes of ice because they're kind of melty because they've been sitting out for a minute. Collins glass, 2 cubes of ice. Can you guys see what I'm doing here? Hold on. Slightly better. Okay. So the instructions call for an orange, a couple of ice cubes, and ginger ale. No alcohol. It's going to be non-alcoholic tonight, in part because not everybody likes to drink alcohol, in part because it's the Prohibition anniversary, and in part because I just didn't feel like drinking alcohol tonight. So, pretty interesting instructions. So the first thing you have to do is you have to cut the peel from the orange in a spiral. So I have with me this very little hooky shaped knife. I don't know if everybody can see that. Look at that. I believe it's called a supreme knife, not because it's the best, but because you use it to supreme fruit, mostly citrus fruit. That means that you cut the rind off and then you take out the inside of each section of citrus fruit, usually for like salads and stuff. But I thought it was a very appropriate knife to try and cut the peel off of this orange all in one piece. So that's what we're going to try and do. I've never done it before. I'm going to roll my sleeves up. We'll see how successful I am. And in the meantime, if anybody wants to say anything and entertain me while I'm attempting to do this, please feel free to do so in the comments. Oh man, this is harder than it looks, you guys. It's also taking longer than if a professional was doing this. Not kind of a professional, right? I'm also probably getting way too much of the pith, and I have no idea how wide this is supposed to be, but that's okay. This orange has also been sitting out for a couple of days, so it's probably not as juicy as it could be, but that's part of the reason why I wanted to make this cocktail, because I didn't want to waste these yummy oranges that I got there. Heirloom navel oranges. Ironically, I think they're from California, not Florida. And of course, that's why it's called the Florida Special. It's because it has oranges in it. Oh, look at that. I think I did pretty good. I didn't leave too much on there. So it says to add your long spiral to the glass with your ice cubes. We'll see how that goes. And then you're supposed to take half of the orange, the juice of half of an orange, but I think that's a little ridiculous considering that I just peeled this whole orange. What am I going to use the other half for? So I'm going to do both halves. And the Juice-O-Matic is making another appearance. So I looked this up because someone said last time, how old is that? And I didn't know. Yay, Juice-O-Matic. Somebody liked it. That's cute. And this particular model was patented between 1938 and 1939. So that means it's from the 40s, which is earlier than I thought. Kind of makes sense because it's got kind of like this deco look going on here. Right, very deco looking. So I'm going to crank it up. Put my orange half. Sweetie Pie is like very excited because she can smell the orange right now. Put my orange half on. Got my little cup in place. Oh man. Oh, it's always harder than I think it's going to be. Can you imagine making fresh squeezed orange juice every morning? How long it would take you to make orange juice? You probably appreciate it a lot more. Okay, did I not put this in properly? Maybe after I washed it. Come here. There we go. Let me just double check. No, it's not supposed to be locked in there anyway. It's just a very sticky orange, I guess. So here's number 2. Ooh, 11 people are watching. Say hello in the comments, everybody. I want to see who's joining us. Okay. I think that's just about done. Is it gonna suck itself back up again? Yep, wow, that really sealed on there. There we go. It's probably because there's no skin on the orange. That makes it stickier. Okay. Back down it goes. Got my orange juice with my orange. Oh, that looks good, actually. Putting that in there. I am also going to add, even though the recipe doesn't call for it, some orange bitters. I love bitters. I looked up a little bit about the history of bitters. It's kind of murky. Starts out as sort of like a nutritional supplement and ends up being used in cocktails. The main bittering ingredient is usually gentian root, which is very bitter. But there's all kinds of stuff in them. These ones are orange, so I'm just going to put a couple dashes in there. That was 3. That was kind of a lot probably, but that's okay. And then we're going to fill with our grocery store brand ginger ale. And of course, as with last time, I'm just gonna go over here too. Oh, it's making me nervous. I'm afraid I'm gonna knock it off. As with last time, I have a straw, nice metal straw. It's very fizzy. I don't know, this is kind of an unwieldy orange peel in there. Let's see how it tastes. That's pretty good. Not as orangey as I thought it would be. Yeah. Yep. That was a good choice. Thanks, 1917, for the Florida special. For those of you who are maybe just joining Food History Happy Hour, the Florida special is the orange peel of a single orange cut in a spiral. The juice of half an orange it calls for originally, but I put it in the whole thing. I also added a couple dashes of bitters, and then you fill with ginger ale in a Collins glass, which is what I did. And as I said, we're not having cranberry juice for a variety of reasons, one of which is I can't get to the store, and the other of which is that there's a scandal around cranberries. We talked about this a little bit last week. Am I missing comments again? I think I am. Oh my gosh, yes I am. I'm so sorry, everybody. Andy posts, Sweetie Pie is the bestest dog ever. Oh, hi, Brandy. Thanks for joining us. Hi, Tiffany. Yay. Okay. I'm super excited. Hi, Amanda. Everybody. No booze, Amanda. I'm sorry. I'm going to alternate, I think, the alcoholic and the non-alcoholic. I definitely did contemplate doing the Applejack Rabbit. I might do that one next time, which, spoiler alert, has Applejack in it. Anyway, I got distracted by comments. So, cranberries. So, in the 1950s, scientists with the FDA were doing research into what became known as carcinogens, one of which was soot, another of which was tobacco, smoking tobacco, believe it or not. And they got this law passed. Whose name I'm forgetting? Let me look it up quickly. Give me 1 second. It's the Food Additives Amendment of 1958, which is consumer safety legislation from the FDA. It's called the Delaney Clause after James J. Delaney, who's Democratic congressman from Queens. And basically it said if a foodstuff had any trace of a carcinogen in it, it would not be approved for human consumption. So they started doing some testing of foodstuffs one of which was cranberries. Now, at the time, cranberries were only marginally associated with alcohol. Cranberries are native to North America. They've been around forever. Indigenous people use them and taught European immigrants how to use them. But cranberry juice was not really in widespread use at all. Cranberries were for holidays, mostly in sauce, cranberry sauce at Thanksgiving and Christmas. And because of that, some historians speculate that the cranberry industry didn't really want to associate itself with alcohol because it had this very sort of wholesome, holiday, family, child-friendly association. There goes Sweetie Pie, barking at nothing, her favorite pastime. But so they didn't really want it associated with alcohol. However, in the 1950s, with this Food Additive Act, they started testing stuff, and the cranberry industry applied for permission to use an herbicide called, I've tried to remember it a bunch of times and I just can't remember. Aminotriazole. There we go. Aminotriazole. It's a chlorophyll inhibitor, so it prevents weeds from growing in cranberry bogs and competing with cranberries. Now, initially, they were going to ask to apply it only after cranberries had been harvested. And then they were kind of like, well, maybe if a little bit gets in the cranberries, it'll be okay. So the FDA was like, we should test that. And they did. And they found traces of aminotriazole on harvested cranberries that had been bound for public consumption. And they basically started seizing all of these loads of cranberries, and people flipped out that their cranberries were poisoned and it was going to, hurt people. There were no cranberries on the market. Basically, they'd all been pulled for testing. Newspapers and magazines were like, here are all the alternatives to cranberry sauce that you can serve at Thanksgiving, because of course it's right before Thanksgiving. So it was a big scare. Eventually they did release 99% of the crop back on the market because it tested clean, so people could have cranberries in time for Christmas. But the interesting thing is, and this is such an American thing to do, is that a number of presidential candidates, including Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy, willfully consumed cranberry products in, defiance of this idea that cranberries were bad for you because they're so American and we have to be American. So that did kind of scare people off of cranberries for a little while. An interesting thing, somebody wrote their whole dissertation on this, which I think is fantastic. I haven't read it, but I did see a reference to it today. And apparently they did some congressional hearings about aminotriazole. And one of the people present for those congressional hearings was a scientist named Rachel Carson. And we all know what she went on to do in 1962, published Silent Spring about the effects of DDT. So cranberries have sort of an ancillary role in figuring out that maybe we shouldn't be putting chemicals on everything and eating them. Of course, the Food Additives Act ultimately said, well, if we have the super high levels of, carcinogen testing, then nothing is going to be safe to eat eventually. So they kind of rolled that back a little bit. And it's a little bit of a controversy still today, what's an allowable carcinogen. And a lot of people kind of poo-poo it. The World Health Organization, for instance, has come out and said that, nitrates and salted meats and grilled meats and smoked meats are carcinogens. And people are like, well, oh, well, I love that too much to stop eating it. Guess I'm going to get cancer. Because that's just how people are. They don't like to change their eating habits very much. So there's your cranberry story. That's why I don't have cranberry juice. Oh, I can also say that after this scandal, cranberry companies, with the help of chemicals like aminotriazole, were able to increase production, and they were sort of looking for new ways to market cranberries and cranberry juice. So we start to get things like craisins, right? Cranberry juice, starting in the 1950s, started being combined with alcohol, usually vodka, sometimes rum. So you get things like Cape Codders and Sea Breezes, and then all the way up into the 90s, when it really skyrockets, you get Cosmopolitans, which of course are the very pink martini made famous by the Sex and the City show. So I thought all those cocktails were kind of boring. So I didn't want to make any 1960s, vodka, and which I don't have in the house, and cranberry, and like a squeeze of lime, which I also don't have in the house. So instead, we're having the Florida special tonight. Oh, yum, which I think is better than a Cosmo anyway. So that's cranberries. Does anybody else have any questions before I move on to my next topic of the evening? Hi, Vanessa, and Tony, and Jessica. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to take a drink, and you guys can let me know if you have any questions. Suspiciously silent. Amanda, what are you making for yourself? You said you were going to make a cocktail. Anybody else drinking anything fun? Heather says Cosmos are her favorite. She loves them so much. I did drink a fair number of Cosmos in my college days. But I just don't like vodka very much. It's kind of pointless. It doesn't taste like anything. So I'd rather drink something more interesting. Although Cosmos, if I'm going to drink vodka, Cosmo would probably be what I would drink. Oh, more comments. You can eat cranberries raw, Chad Wallock. Aaron is not incorrect. Did you angry face? For those of you who don't know, Aaron and Chad are married, and they are now arguing with each other in the comments section. I love you guys. You can totally eat cranberries raw, and cranberry relish, raw cranberry relish with orange is delicious. I also like syrup-soaked cranberries, which is technically they're raw, although you don't pour hot syrup over them. And then you roll them in sugar. I make that for the holidays. They're fantastic. I don't know if they still use aminotriazole anymore. I should probably look that up. But I love cranberries. I think they're delicious. So somebody else asked, I don't know if she's watching. Maybe she's not. Marianne Coffey. I'm missing all these comments again. Amanda says vodka's the only thing I have in my house. Good for you. Ooh, Janice drinking homemade tonic with lime. The homemade tonic? How do you make homemade tonic? That sounds awesome. Heather says, you don't have a flavor palette? Of course you do. Oh, Chad says Aaron thought they were more sweet. Yeah, no, you don't really eat cranberries by the handful unless they're coated in sugar. I'm going to shut the door. Hold on just a second. I'm getting noise, interference from the other room. My husband was on a phone call. Ooh, Amanda asked, have I ever had tomato marmalade? What's the difference between jam, jelly, and marmalade? So even though I have never made my own scandal, speaking of scandals, I know the answer to that. So a jelly is made from fruit juice. They are supposed to be clear, and they're usually thickened with pectin, either commercially produced pectin, or you can thicken some jelly. Some jellies naturally have pectin occurring in them, like apples, or you can use crab apples or green apples when you're cooking it to make pectin. Jam is usually made from mashed whole fruit. Preserves are often made from unmashed whole fruit. And marmalade is usually made from the rind of something, but it's basically slivers of fruit or fruit rind that are cooked slowly, so they kind of get like candied, suspended in like a jelly-like consistency. Most marmalade is not my favorite because orange marmalade historically is made from Seville oranges from Spain, which are quite bitter. So I'm not really a huge fan of the bitter sweetness without a lot of acidity. Like, for instance, I love grapefruit, but fresh grapefruit is quite a bit more acid. So I have to admit, I haven't had like super great quality marmalade, but I've had some pretty good quality marmalade, and it's just not my favorite. But you can make marmalade out of a lot of things besides citrus fruits. Like, people make carrot marmalade. Obviously, tomato marmalade, I've never had it. I assume it's sweet. Tomato's technically a fruit. People used to eat tomatoes with like cream and sugar and stuff. We just don't do that anymore. Sorry, Erin, for giving away your deepest secret about cranberries. Hi, Steven! Thanks for joining us. Is Melody there with you? I hope so. You can tell this is just a show for me and my friends, I guess. So one of the other questions that I got in the last week was my friend Marianne asked me, when does the term comfort food first come into use? I thought that was a great question. Really tested my research skills. But apparently it was first used in the 1960s in like a psychology text that was referencing people who eat, children in particular, who eat for comfort, right? So I did try and find out if there were any earlier references, and I used something called Google Ngram, which, if you haven't used it, is a pretty fun tool, but you have to be a little bit careful with it. And this is a good example of why, because even though I searched comfort food with quotation marks, meant to search for the phrase, I got some hits like in the 1840s, got a bunch of hits in the 1940s, turn of the century. So then I went to Google Books, which is what Google Ngram searches, all of Google Books for phrases, to see the frequency of use. And I realized that all of those hits that I was getting, because you can search Google Books by date, right, and phrase. I realized that all of those hits I was getting were comfort, comma, food, or comfort, period. And then the next sentence starts with food. What we're looking for. However, Google Ngram does show that starting in the early 80s, the use of the term comfort food skyrockets. Probably to coincide with the recession in the 1980s, right? Somebody coined the term, and then everybody started using it. What are you guys talking about? No, Amanda, not people who eat children. Children who eat for comfort. Oh, you guys are so funny. Oh, hi, Barry. What's the difference between comfort food and soul food? So soul food is very specific to African American culture, and African American culture comes largely out of the South, and in many instances, a lot of foods that are considered soul food have direct connections to slavery and slavery foods, which is why some African Americans kind of reject soul food. In fact, there's a whole group who are embracing African-based veganism as a rejection of soul food. But soul food is typically sweet potatoes, greens, smoked pork products, macaroni and cheese, sweet potato pie, pecan pie, if that's how some of you pronounce it. So I think a lot of soul foods qualify as comfort food, but they're not necessarily one and the same. Kind of like all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares, sort of a thing. But yes, comfort food is definitely dependent on your cultural upbringing, I would say. A lot of comfort foods take people back to their childhood and some of their childhood favorites, or the foods that they ate when they were sick. Anna Catherine and I were having a discussion the other day about people who, like, why is chicken soup or chicken broth persist in our discussion about invalid cookery, which, if you think about it, crackers in chicken soup, that seems like a totally 19th century Victorian thing. They put crackers in liquids all the time. But that's really something that persists that I think we don't really think about. But I think most people would think chicken soup is pretty comforting food. Macaroni and cheese, mashed potatoes, I think those tend to be fairly universal comfort foods. But anyway, so that was a fun little search. Oh, Glenn is schooling me in how to use engrams. But I didn't want it at the start of a sentence, Glenn. I wanted it in the middle of a sentence, and it still put that period in there. But I think that's partially because most Google books are using OCR text reading, which isn't always the most accurate, especially with historic texts that maybe have been scanned poorly. So you always got to double check. Heather, where was soup invented? That is a great question, Heather. In part because soup was invented probably in a cave or on some plain somewhere when someone decided, hey, look, animal stomachs are watertight, and if we put hot rocks in them and water and other stuff, it will cook it. Because that's basically the first soup, is you take an animal stomach, hopefully cleaned out, you fill it with whatever you want to cook and some water, and then you heat up rocks in a very hot fire and you drop them in. So those of you who grew up with the book Stone Soup, that's kind of where that comes from. Because of course, before you have pottery, and certainly before you have metal cooking vessels, you can't really cook over a fire. You can't cook liquids over a fire. You had to bring the fire into the liquid, which is what you do with hot rocks. So, anybody else have any other questions? I am actually actively trying to keep up with comments this time. No? Okay, I don't know if she's watching, but, well, Andy also asked this, but Anna Catherine asked, when did we start using level measurements in the United States, and why don't we weigh things when we're baking in the US? So it's a little bit of a complicated question that doesn't have a super great answer, but basically, when Europeans sort of decided to start using the metric system, Americans signed on that we would recognize the metric system, but not necessarily that we were going to adopt it ourselves. So pretty much before the metric system, we did weigh food, but not in the way that we do now, of course, because, you know, in the 18th century, we didn't really have digital kitchen scales. People did often have weighing scales in their homes, particularly if they were engaged in any sort of business endeavor where you would have to weigh money, because before the United States had its own currency, really, we used gold. And you know, if you've ever heard of pieces of 8, right, that's an eighth, usually of a Spanish piece of silver, a Spanish silver dollar. But you could also sell things by weight. And then, of course, also if you went to a store, you weren't buying a package of something. The grocer was weighing out how much you wanted out of bulk containers. So people did use weights, but they used imperial weights. Not quite the same as British imperial weights because we don't measure things by like stones like they do. And then we also have volume measurements, which is how most Americans cook and bake today. So historically, they use things like, pints, quarts, gallons. I learned that a gill is a quarter of a pint, also known as half a cup, which is kind of fun. And then, of course, doing some bartending research, I learned all kinds of fun stuff about bartending measurements, which we'll get into in a minute. But most people, when they were learning to cook, it was a lot more by feel. And particularly before the invention of chemical leaveners, or the widespread use of chemical leaveners like baking soda, baking powder, cream of tartar, some of the earlier baker's ammonia, also called hartshorn. That was a very early chemical leavener. Pearl ash was another early chemical leavener. So before people really started using that a lot for baking, you were using stuff like homemade yeast or eggs. And homemade yeast and eggs are both fairly variable. Some people did weigh their eggs and weigh their butter, like pound cake, pound of butter, pound of sugar, pound of flour, I think also a pound of eggs. Because of course chickens weren't standardized, they didn't lay standard size eggs. So you kind of had to figure it out. So a lot of early cooking, up until really the mid 19th century, and even a little bit past that, people had to use their judgment every time they cooked. You kind of had to know how things were supposed to look, how they were supposed to feel, how thick a batter was supposed to be, how long do I need this? Oh, well, it's going to depend on what kind of flour I'm using, what's the moisture content, how strong is my yeast, is it humid outside? Oh, how long should I let this raise? Well, how hot out is it? You kind of had to, it was a little bit looser than cooking is today because so many more things in how we cook are much more standardized than they used to be. So if you ever looked at old recipes, I just baked a cake yesterday, which you will be able to learn about in a blog post on Saturday, that had no instructions for cooking temperature, cooking time, or what kind of container you're supposed to put it in. So luckily I know enough about baking that I was able to figure it out. But that's not true of everyone. In part because recipes today have been tested and sort of perfected in order to be foolproof. And the person who really brings that into the mainstream is a woman by the name of Fannie Merritt Farmer. Now, if you read the article about food and the Spanish flu pandemic, you will have met Fannie Farmer. If you know about the Fannie Farmer cookbook or the Boston Cooking School, you will probably have heard of Fannie Farmer. She is known as the mother of level measurements. So in part because she believed, she's very scientific minded, and she believed that a lot of the problems that people had with recipes were because they weren't following the instructions correctly. So in order to replicate the experiment that is a recipe, you have to follow the instructions exactly. That was kind of her philosophy. So she really mainstreams measuring cups and spoons, level measurements, right? Which means no heaping anything. You put the spoon in or the cup and you use the flat of a knife and level it off so it's exact. So she really kind of pioneers that in ordinary people's households. Measuring cups and spoons definitely existed before her, but she's the one who popularizes them. And of course, this is after a lot of European countries had already adopted the metric system. So, we kind of embrace that. There's a lot of people are like, measuring is the only way to bake. And, I'm not a super exacting person in the kitchen. I like to improvise a lot, even with baking, which can be a bit dangerous if you don't really know what you're doing, but I like to think that I know what I'm doing, so I make very few mistakes when it comes to baking usually. But part of that is because I know how things are supposed to look, how they're supposed to feel when I'm baking bread. You know, you can knead it by feel. You can be like, this is drier than it's supposed to be. Did I forget something? Is the recipe missing something? And you can kind of adjust as you go. So I personally think that weighing everything for baked goods is a little lazy, dare I say it. It's a controversial thing to say, perhaps. But I think there's a lot of variables even in baking that don't always get taken into account. So that's measurements. Oh, we're going to talk about bar measurements. So when I was doing all this cocktail research, one of the things I ran across was a measurement called a pony. What's a pony? So if you remember last time we talked about a jigger and a shot, I was slightly wrong. A jigger, I guess, in modern times is usually 1.5 ounces, which is also what a shot glass usually is. And a pony is 1 ounce. So it's called a pony because it's a little bit shorter than a jigger. I also could not figure out for the Hoffman Fizz last time, it called for the use of a split glass, which I could not find that reference anywhere, and I did a fair amount of searching. And it turns out that a split is a measurement of 6 fluid ounces. So I was supposed to have a 6-ounce glass, which, who knew that? I didn't. But now I do. And I did, if anybody goes to the event, I did post a list of a bunch of other bartending measurements, which are pretty fun if you want to take a look. Yes, Heather, I also like to think of recipes as more of guidelines. Hi, Neil! Thanks for joining us. Okay, so we're most of the way through the history hour, actually, although I can keep going if people have more questions. I haven't given you much of a chance to ask questions this time because I've been too busy talking about questions from last time. But I think I have run through all of my pre-prepared questions. So does anyone have anything else they want to say or ask? If you're just joining us, it's a Food History Happy Hour. I'm Sarah, the food historian. I'm drinking the Florida Special, which in light of, Florida Man, sounds like it would have been a really big mistake, which is what Emily said when I asked what cocktails I should make. But I thought it sounded delicious, and I had oranges that I wanted to use up, so that's why I made it. So it's the rind of 1 orange, the juice of supposed to be half an orange. I put the whole orange in there. And then you fill it with ginger ale. I also added a couple dashes of orange bitters because I wanted to. So that's the Florida Special from a 1917 cocktail book. Okay, Andy Post asked, when did macaroni and cheese find its way into American hearts? Oh, Neil could probably help a little bit with that. Neil is also a food historian. And this is more in his bailiwick because macaroni and cheese dates back to Thomas Jefferson. He brought over macaroni from Italy, among other things, including rice, which I believe he smuggled out of the country because it was illegal to take out of the country. And then, of course, white sauce, classic British food. Add some cheese in there and you have bechamel, French sauce. And that's when you get macaroni and cheese. So it had been around for a while, but it's really during the 1920s and into the Great Depression that macaroni and cheese gets very popular as a dinner. It's super cheap to make. And as we all know, it's delicious. It's easy. It's fast. We're talking about comfort food. Macaroni and cheese is definitely one of my comfort foods. When I'm having a bad day and I want a hurry up dinner, I make macaroni and cheese with scratch cheese sauce, because if you know what you're doing, making a cheese sauce from scratch is pretty easy. And if anyone is interested, I can share my recipe after the broadcast. They are delicious. Neil Marino said orange bitters are delicious, and they are. Although in this particular recipe, I think the rind of the orange is also supposed to provide some bittering agents. But I would not make this with commercial orange juice. It's too sour. Yeah. Oh, Aaron says, Michael wants to know about the history of chili. That's a very good question. Okay, wait, we're going to talk about macaroni and cheese first because Neil says the first modern recipe for macaroni and cheese is included in Elizabeth Raffald's 1770 book, The Experienced English Housekeeper. Awesome. Yes, wonderful. So the Brits, they knew what they were about, even in the 1770s. Okay, we're going to put chili on hold a little bit because it's related. Heather just asked, what's the most cost-effective food to make during the Great Depression? So during the Great Depression, money was tight for a lot of people. And the classic American slab of meat with mashed potatoes and bread and a vegetable maybe on the side was expensive. Meat was still very expensive. So during the Great Depression, ground beef became pretty popular as a cheap meat that you could get for not very much money and that you could also stretch to feed a lot of tamale pie and chop suey, country goulash. Those things were all pretty common. Spaghetti and meatballs start to be a thing, but also macaroni and cheese. People would have what they called rent parties, where you would make a giant batch of some really cheap, usually very starch-based, usually pasta-based dish. You invite all your friends over, they would all chip in some money, and then you could make rent. And that's how you would pay for rent. So yeah, people were pretty savvy at that time. If you were in the South, I think Barry was talking about food in the South, especially in the Southwest, like Oklahoma, Texas, that area. Pinto beans with cornbread was another very cheap dish. And if you had some raw onion and some pepper vinegar, maybe some greens, you could make that taste pretty good. I actually really love pinto beans with raw onion and something vinegary. Try it if you haven't, it's delicious. Yeah, that's what a lot of people were doing. My grandmother came from a huge family. My grandfather on my mom's side came from a huge family. And my mom talks about remembering, I mean, obviously she didn't grow up in the Great Depression, but my grandparents' generation did. Remembers my aunt who had a bunch of kids would take like 1 pound of hamburger and then a ton of pasta and then home canned tomatoes. And she'd make like a giant vat of what's basically goulash, maybe some onion in there. And that would feed a lot of people for really not a lot of money. So, hi, Anna Catherine. Thanks for joining us. You missed, we talked about measurements. You'll have to go back and watch later. Does anybody else have any other questions for me? I feel like so many of you are joining late. Maybe we should go longer than an hour. What do we think? Oh, chili. I didn't talk about chili. I'm sorry, Aaron. So chili is related a little bit to the Great Depression. Obviously, chili dates back pretty far in the American Southwest. I don't know if the indigenous people were eating meat with tomatoes, but obviously tomatoes are from South America. Chilies are definitely native to Mexico and the American Southwest. And so I think really probably what's considered American chili is a product of what do I want to say here? Basically Spanish cowboys, I think, probably. Vaqueros. Because of course the American Southwest was Spanish/Mexican for way longer than it's been American, or part of the United States. And slow cooking chunks of beef in chilies is probably the original chili. You can see the name connection there. And of course, people in the Southwest had very strong opinions about chili. A lot of Texans believe that there should absolutely never be any beans in it. Pinto beans, black turtle beans are also native to North and South America. So this might have been an original ingredient, not clear. But it's really not, chili doesn't really go mainstream for the rest of the country until the 1920s and 30s. So in the 1920s and 30s, we have Hollywood, California happening. In the 19-teens, you have some of the first sort of Americanized Mexican foods published in cookbooks from California. And then, of course, you have, excuse me, should not be drinking bubbly drinks, I guess. You have a lot of tourism starting to the American Southwest in the teens, 20s, and 30s. You have the development of Route 66. There's all sorts of earlier train lines, the Atchison, Topeka, and Kansas line, which is Fred Harvey, which is a whole nother story. I can share that story with you guys in a minute. But so people are starting to experience, white, middle, and upper middle class people are starting to experience the foods of the Southwest, and it becomes kind of trendy. Particularly in the 30s, there's a lot like fashion, Mexican peasant embroideries and skirts become very fashionable. And it sort of becomes embraced by Hollywood, and that's kind of when Southwest and Tex-Mex food really starts to take off in the United States. So there's your answer about chili. I personally love what I call Midwestern chili, which I make for some of the volunteers at my husband's job every year, which is tomatoes, tomato paste, a can each of pinto, black, and kidney beans, onions, ground beef, and then of course I put spices, corn sometimes. Sometimes I even put celery in it. Don't judge, it's delicious. But it's not super spicy, which is why I call it Midwest chili. And of course, because it has beans and I love beans. So, all right. Anybody else have any other questions? We can hang out for longer than an hour if you want to. Oh, I can also tell you, Andy, when you were talking about pints, I did look up. A pint is a standardized measurement that is 16 fluid ounces. So I don't know how big pints are in Canada, but that's why they're 16 ounces in the United States. Like pint canning jars are 16 ounces. So am I missing one? Neil, American chop suey. Yeah, chop suey, we didn't really discuss this last time, but it has a lot of names. Sorry, not a lot of names. It's one name for a lot of different foods. So the chop suey that I was talking about last time is the sort of quasi, vaguely, we drove by it, Asian inspired dish of ground beef, green peppers, onions, and soy sauce, usually with noodles. But some people call American goulash chop suey, which is usually ground beef, onions, tomatoes, and pasta, sometimes with ketchup. That's how my mother-in-law makes it. It's delicious. Oh, and awesome! Erin says, inspired by last week's episode, we made tamale pie too. Very good. Yay! Now send me your recipe so I can try it, because I haven't yet. What else do you guys want to talk about? Oh, I can tell you, just a little report, that I started some book research again today, sort of tying up some loose ends. And I found more stuff about the Spanish flu epidemic, which is mainly that in New York City, the Mayor's Committee of Women on National Defense, such a ridiculous name. So there was the Mayor's Committee on National Defense and the Mayor's Committee of Women on National Defense. And the Mayor's Committee of Women on National Defense created an emergency committee to deal with Spanish flu. One of those emergency committees had to do with food production, but they also had a transportation committee, which mobilized women with automobiles and automobile clubs to deliver food to people who needed it because they were Spanish flu. And of course, like all really great progressive era reports, it had lots of numbers. So for instance, they delivered over 16,000 quarts of soup. And what is it, like 36,000 quarts, sorry, not 36,000, 3,600 quarts of, I think they said puddings and cereals, and 330 cups of jelly. Yep, and they delivered them by automobile, which is pretty cool. Yes, Aaron, early Uber Eats, kind of, yes, yeah. So the Spanish flu really did a number on a lot of cities. New York City was not as bad. Unlike a lot of other cities, they did not close their schools, which has been kind of a debate with coronavirus. But also in New York City, they were a lot more, I don't want to say authoritarian, but, you know, kind of much more trusting in authority. And so they basically used the schools to monitor the health of children and weed out anybody who had Spanish flu, basically. So at the time, they were saying that that's part of the reason why New York wasn't as badly infected as other cities. I think it's because New York quarantined all the ships that were coming into the port for like months before the flu got really bad. So they just weren't introducing that many new cases to the city, I don't think. Anna Catherine, don't forget the bean sprouts and chop suey. Okay, canned bean sprouts, I'm guessing. It would not surprise me if canned mushrooms and canned water chestnuts made their way in there also. Although that would have come probably after World War II. Yeah. All the things that Americans can do with ground beef. It's our favorite. If you think about it, like pretty much everything Americans make with ground beef is sort of like a not very good version of some other country's food. Hamburgers are German, meatballs are supposed to be Italian, they're not really. Chop suey. I guess we already talked about meatballs, spaghetti sauce, Swedish meatballs we talked about last time. Tamale pie, all that fun stuff. Ooh, yes, Neil brings up 1918 war cake, a very thrifty boiled fruit cake made with a scant amount of fat, margarine, and no eggs. I actually have been thinking about trying something called wacky cake, which is I believe World War II cake that uses vinegar and I believe baking soda as the leavener. I haven't had the time to go through my recipes and track it down. But yeah, so one of the things, the food committee, the subcommittee, food committee of the Mayor's Committee of Women on National Defense, if I keep saying it, it'll come out easier and easier, I think. They, for the summer of 1918, did a series of demonstrations at their New York City community kitchen, thrift kitchen, community kitchen. And Saturday was about war cakes and other desserts. So how to cook and bake desserts under the rationing, which by 1918 included rationing sugar. So yeah, interesting stuff. Neil, if you have a recipe, you'll have to share it with us. I'm also going to make the suggestion on the air that Neil DiMarino should do his own food historian happy hour and talk about food in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Because I think between the two of us, then we would have all of American food history covered. Okay, people. We're at an hour. Does anybody else, you guys want to keep going? Or should we be done for the evening? I'm almost done with my beverage. What do you think? Oh, Irina just joined. Right at the end. Oh no, maybe we will have to keep going. Welcome, Dr. Gelman. Thanks for joining us. Neil, when you say okay, do you mean you're actually going to do a live stream or are you going to share your recipe? We don't know yet. Oh, Heather, why did I pick this time period? So I'm going to assume that you mean the progressive era in World War I. So I had been interested in food and agricultural history, mostly agricultural history actually, in undergrad for kind of a while. But because I'm from the Midwest, I'm from North Dakota originally, for those of you who don't know. The Midwest has a much more recent history of white European settlement than the Northeast does. So most of the history in North Dakota in terms of white settlement comes after 1860, believe it or not. Kind of hard to believe, I know, but so there really weren't a lot of local history resources prior to that that I could use unless I wanted to go to archaeological records, which I had no interest in. And then of course also I grew up a lot with, sorry, I'm touching my face, but it's fine because I haven't left the house in like 5 days. I grew up with, Laura Ingalls Wilder and American Girl books. So I was always really interested in the Victorian period. And then when I got to graduate school, I realized that the progressive era was very fascinating. And in particular, World War I, the home front aspects of World War I were very understudied. Almost nobody had done any research on them. And for my master's thesis, I based it on a scrapbook that one of my museum former coworkers told me about of the Orange County Food Preservation Battalion, which is a group of society ladies from Harriman, Tuxedo Park area in Orange County, who got together to, Neil is looking for the recipe, thank you, Neil, who got together and decided that they were going to do something to help the war effort, and they focused on food conservation. So they ran an instruction train on the Erie Railroad, and they opened a canning kitchen. And the more I learned about it, just the more obsessed that I got. And the more and more and more resources I found, I'm still finding them. And so I decided I wanted to turn my thesis into a book. And to do that, you have to read a lot of secondary sources, which is actually my least favorite part, believe it or not, of being a food historian, is reading up. I'd rather do my own primary source research, but it's a necessary evil to understand the context of everything that's happening. So yeah, that's why I picked that time period. Also, these parallels aren't really made that often, although every once in a while a historian will come out and say it, but a lot of things that were happening in the 19-teens are mirroring quite closely what's happening now. So the progressive era, we're coming out of the Gilded Age, where we have extreme income inequality. There's no worker protections. The federal government isn't particularly strong. We don't have a federal income tax until the 19 teens. That's, if anybody's been watching Ken Burns' Prohibition movie like I was a little while ago, you learn that until we have federal income tax, the vast majority of federal tax dollars come from alcohol tax, which is, we're drinking so much alcohol, you guys. But, you know, you have this extreme income inequality, and out of that come a lot of middle and upper middle class people, usually white Protestants, who are interested in reforms. You know, they care about other people, basically. But all the stuff around labor and labor unions, around women's rights, around immigration, around food safety, all of this stuff is happening in the 19 teens, and there are a lot of parallels to what's happening today. Yeah, just a lot of political similarities. Ooh, Neil has shared a 1917 war cake. Awesome. Yeah, some really innovative stuff happens when you force people to ration. Yep. Oh, Heather's correcting me. She says 1916 is federal income tax. So that was 19. Oh, maybe 1913 is when we create the Federal Reserve. That might be it. It's been a while since I did my chapter on economics, and the Depression of 1893 happening again. We'll find out. That was a big crash. Yes, Anna Catherine, amen on the mirroring. Yeah, a lot of similarities, which, small rant, I think if we actually studied the Progressive Era and World War I in schools, maybe it wouldn't be happening as much as it is now. Maybe it would, who knows. But definitely one of my favorite memes to come out recently is the one that's of like historians are like, can you please just listen to us? It's all happening again. Yeah, historians are always a little bit doomed to see the parallels. Yes, Heather is an accountant. She says every tax accounting class makes us memorize that. Yep. Yeah, the food stuff actually, so I was originally interested in agriculture because a lot of, and I'm going to go on a little agriculture rant here, which is technically food history, they're definitely related. Basically all of our agricultural ills kind of start in the Progressive Era. So prior to the 1900s, most American farmers lived producer lives where they produced most of the things that they needed to survive themselves. And during the 1900s, 19-teens, there started to be a really big push to turn farmers into consumers. So one of the papers I wrote for a graduate school research class was called No Occupation, which was how farm women were listed in the census records as having no occupation, despite the fact that for the most part they were equal producers on the farmstead, largely in charge of dairies, unless it was a full-on dairy farm, but they were often in charge of dairies and butter production, butter and cream production, which brought in cash onto farms, which is unusual. They were usually in charge of egg production, which also brought in cash onto farms, which generally did not have a lot of exchanges of cash. And starting in the 19-teens, there was a push to sort of professionalize what was women's work, and you start to get the rise of, I should say, the decline of diversified farming in favor of monocropping, as it's called, where you specialize in one thing and you just raise that one thing. which has its benefits, but also has a lot more risks, and kind of has resulted in our highly mechanized, industrialized agricultural system that we have today, which I'm not really a fan of. But I'll stop boring you now with agriculture before I start talking about agricultural policy. You're lucky I like food more than I like agriculture history. But they are all related. They are all related. All right, folks. I think I'm going to stop this in about 5 minutes because I don't want to bore everybody to death. So, any last questions before I say goodbye? I'm also almost out of drink. Can't believe it's taking me an hour to drink this, but I guess that's what happens when you're the one doing all the talking. Anybody? I will let everybody know that if you are not on my email list, you should totally join, which you can do at my website, thefoodhistorian.com. Also, we have a couple of patrons of the Food Historian with us tonight. I have a Patreon that you can give me a little monthly donation if you want to, not required, but helpful, helps me pay for my website and all that fun stuff. And then also somebody asked if I was going to do any classes. So if you're interested in classes, let me know what you'd be most interested in. One of my friends did ask me if I would do a class on digital research, which I think I might do, but I think that's a little esoteric for some of you non-historians out there. So if you have any other ideas for classes, and if you want to hear more about 18th century history, let's all badger Neil into doing a live stream, because they're pretty fun. Alrighty, do we have any more comments? Heather says, teach me how to make all the cakes. Well, Heather, if you go to my blog on Saturday, or if you sign up for my email, you get it in your inbox. You will get a very easy cake recipe for a 1897 buttermilk cake that is probably one of the easiest cakes I've ever made. Like, really easy. Easier than the Lazy Daisy cake, which literally has the word lazy in it. And a super delicious frosting that I just made up. It's not historical, I just made it up, but it's really good. Ooh, Heather says, how about historic research for non-historians? I mean, yeah, the stuff that I'm going to be talking about is applicable for anybody. I'm not, I don't work for a university, so I don't get paid research stipends or get to take time off to go to physical archives. So I do most of my research online, and that has made me pretty good at finding stuff online. So that's what the class would be about. Heather, but all the cake. I will keep doing cake recipes if you want me to. I did do Neil's New York gingerbread recipe not too long ago. Didn't turn out quite the same as Neil's did. I think in part because my ground ginger was probably a little old, and I think my baking soda was a little old. Still delicious, not as fluffy or as spicy as Neil's version. Neil, are you saying only with you you'll do a live stream with me? That'd be pretty fun, or maybe we can host a little webinar or something. I would be totally up for that. Okay, last call. Last call for questions. 30 seconds left. No, I'm just kidding. We can do more than 30 seconds, but. Uh-oh. Yum. All right, well, that's done. Okay. Neil says maybe. It's so fun. Alrighty, friends. Oh my gosh, 2 more comments. Yes, Neil, we should totally do fish house punch. Yes, Neil makes Amazing, amazing fish house punch. I've had it once before. So, all right. With that, thank you everybody for joining us again for the second episode of the Food History Happy Hour. I'm your host, Sarah Wasberg Johnson, the food historian. And we will see you next Friday at 8 o'clock. All right. Have a good night.